They wanted me to live in a shed. My own daughter, pregnant and glowing, stood in my living room and announced, with a smile, that the baby needed my bedroom, that I'd be moving into the shed out back. To them, it made perfect sense. I was just the grandmother, the unpaid maid, the live-in babysitter. I'm Martha, 58, and I've spent 35 years putting my children first. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that I'd already signed something that morning, a deal that would change everything. And by the time they realized, it was already too late. They say motherhood is about sacrifice, and for 35 years, that's exactly what I did. I'm Martha White, 58 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the glue holding everything together, usually in silence, and always at my own expense. It started slow. One favour here, one just for now request there. When my husband Robert walked out, my youngest was 12, and suddenly it was just me, juggling bills, broken pipes, teacher meetings, and late-night tears. I gave up vacations, hobbies, even retirement savings, all to raise 3 children who I hoped would grow up to be grateful, respectful adults. I was wrong. By the time Diane, my oldest, turned 35 and pregnant with her second child, she'd moved back into my house, along with her husband Dan and their 4-year-old son. Just until we get back on our feet, she'd said 8 months ago. But they weren't standing, they were settled, furniture in every room, her kids' toys in every hallway, and dirty dishes piling up like trophies in my sink. My son, Lloyd, wasn't much better. Fresh off a bitter divorce, he'd slinked back home like a rain-soaked cat, dragging unpaid credit card bills and the emotional maturity of a teenager behind him. He rarely spoke, except when he needed something. And when he did speak, it was usually about how hard life had been for him. Only Beverly, my youngest, had managed to keep her independence. She had her own place, her own family, and a job she loved. But even she popped in regularly, for laundry, leftovers, or a little cash, just until payday. And through it all, I stayed quiet, because mothers are supposed to give, to help, to endure, right? That morning, I stood at my kitchen window watching the drizzle hit the glass, listening to the noise of Diane's baby shower as it swelled behind me. The streamers I'd hung were drooping already. My back ached from the hours I'd spent prepping food I couldn't afford, wiping counters that would be dirty again in minutes, but no one noticed. They never do. By noon, my house, my modest 3-bedroom ranch that I paid off one sacrifice at a time, was packed with 23 guests. Diane's friends from work, relatives I hadn't seen since the last milestone, and neighbours who barely knew my name. I served trays, refilled drinks, smiled like it was my job, all while Diane held court in my favourite chair, wearing a dress that cost more than my month's groceries, glowing like a queen, and then she said it, loud, clear, and in front of everyone. We've decided the baby needs the master bedroom, and Mom, she's going to move into the shed. It's actually quite cosy. The room laughed. Someone patted my hand, and in that moment, standing there holding a tray of sandwiches, I realized they didn't just take me for granted. They thought I was never going to say no. But what they didn't know was that I'd already said yes to something else entirely. And that's when everything started to change. It was the way she said it that still gets me. So casual, so certain. Like announcing the colour of the nursery or the name she'd picked out for the baby. We've decided the baby needs the master bedroom, Diane said, her voice sweet as frosting. It's the biggest, and with all the furniture, it just makes sense. And then she turned to me, smile wide, eyes sparkling. Mum's going to move into the shed. We've been fixing it up. It's actually super cozy. There was a ripple of laughter, a few claps. Someone even said, "That's adorable," as if exile was a punchline. I just stood there, tray in hand, my legs suddenly heavier than they'd ever felt in 58 years. I looked at her, my daughter, my firstborn, the child I once stayed up 3 nights in a row with during a fever, and all I could think was, "You really believe this is okay?" The shed, 8 by 10 feet of concrete, drafty in the winter, boiling in the summer, no insulation, no plumbing, no bathroom, a place that had held lawnmowers and broken furniture until a month ago when Dan started renovating it, allegedly for his tools. Now I saw the truth. That had been the plan all along. Diane raised her glass of sparkling cider. This way the baby has room to grow and Grandma's right there for help with everything. Right there, convenient, contained. Not one person in that room questioned it. Not one stopped to ask if I had agreed. Because in their minds, of course I had. Of course I'd give up the one space in the world that was still mine, because I always did. "Mom, isn't it perfect?" Diane asked, grinning like she'd solved a math problem, and I smiled. I smiled so hard my cheeks ached. "It sounds wonderful, sweetheart," I said, "absolutely perfect." Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that I'd already signed the papers that morning. A 6-month lease to a railroad company, $25,000 in my account, and one condition: the house had to be vacant. So let them toast their little victory. Let them plan their nursery in the room I slept in for 15 years. Let them imagine me eating dinner in a shed while they occupied every corner of my home. Because the clock was already ticking. In 1 week they'd be packing, not for a baby, but for a reality they never saw coming. And I'd be long gone, watching it all unfold from a place they never expected. They thought they were writing my story, but I'd just picked up the pen. 3 weeks before the baby shower, I got a call that changed everything. "Martha, this is Margaret Todd Whitman," the voice said. I remembered her instantly, my divorce attorney from years ago. Tough, brilliant, and never one to waste time. "I have a rather unusual proposition for you." I sat at my kitchen table, the same one that had seen 35 years of homework, bills, and holiday dinners. "Go on," I said, curious. She told me about the Riverside Valley Railroad Restoration Project, a luxury tourism company buying up vintage homes along old railway lines to turn into upscale overnight stops for their affluent travellers. They wanted authenticity, small-town charm, a house with history and character. Apparently mine checked every box. $25,000 for a 6-month lease, she said, with the option to renew, but there's a catch. There always is. The property has to be completely empty. No full-time residents. They'll handle staging, cleaning, even minor renovations, but they need it vacant. I paused, thought of Diane in my living room, her feet propped on the coffee table like it was hers. Thought of Dan using my kitchen like a diner. Thought of Lloyd sleeping until noon and never lifting a finger. Thought of my temporary guests who'd become permanent problems. And suddenly, that catch didn't feel like a catch at all. "I'll need a few weeks," I told her. "Of course," Margaret said. "But Martha, this is a way out, a clean one. Think about what you could do with that money." I didn't need to think long. That night, while Diane was watching baby room decor videos and Dan was drinking in the garage, I sat alone and made a list. I wrote down everything I'd given up: vacations, hobbies, weekends, rest, dignity. Then I wrote a new list of everything I still wanted: travel, peace, a door I could close, a room that was mine. And just like that, the decision was made. I signed the lease the next morning, deposited the check the same afternoon, and I didn't tell a soul, because this time I wasn't asking permission. I wasn't explaining myself. I wasn't giving anyone a chance to talk me out of it. They had spent years making plans without me. Now it was my turn. So as Diane paraded her big announcement at the baby shower, as the guests clapped and Lloyd toasted to 3 generations under one roof, I smiled and served sandwiches. Let them think they'd won. Let them believe I was going to sleep in the shed while they took over my house. Because the paperwork was already signed. The date was already set. In 7 days, the house wouldn't belong to them. or to me. It would belong to someone who paid for it and appreciated it. The baby shower ended around 4:30. The guests trickled out in a flurry of hugs, leftover cake, and empty compliments. Diane went to nap, claiming the excitement had worn her out. Dan vanished into the garage, probably to celebrate their victory with Lloyd, who had that smug look of a man who thought he'd successfully manipulated someone. The house fell silent, except for the clink of dirty plates and the low hum of resentment buzzing in my chest. I didn't mind the mess. I knew it would be the last time I ever cleaned up after them. As I scrubbed the counters and boxed up uneaten food, I thought of the lease contract in my purse. Signed, sealed, paid. They had no idea. I was elbow deep in dishwater when I heard the familiar sound of heavy footsteps. Lloyd entered the kitchen with Dan trailing behind him, both moving like they had something important to say. "Mum, we need to talk," Lloyd began, sliding into a seat at the table without asking. Dan leaned against the fridge, arms crossed. "We just want to make sure you're really okay with the shed situation," Dan said, his tone syrupy and practiced. "It's a big change, but we think it really is the best option. For everyone. For everyone." They used that word a lot, as if I didn't count as someone, as if my comfort, my dignity, my home were all just puzzle pieces for their convenience. "You'd still be right there to help," Dan added, "but not underfoot, you know. Your own space, cozy, private." Cozy, that's what they kept calling it. An 8x10 concrete box with no bathroom was cozy. "And it'll save all of us money," Lloyd chimed in, suddenly the financial genius of the family. "I mean, you're not using that big room, and we'd have to rent if you weren't so generous." Generous. That word stuck like gum on the bottom of my shoe. "You've really thought this through," I said, voice steady. They both nodded, visibly relieved. I could almost see the weight lifting off their shoulders. They thought they had my blessing. They thought I was bought, bagged, and boxed up neatly in their grand little plan. "Well," I said slowly, "I think the arrangement is going to work out perfectly." Dan exhaled. Lloyd grinned. "Great, Mum. I knew you'd understand." Oh, I understood. I understood everything. They had moved into my home like squatters, eaten my food, filled my rooms with their problems, and now had the audacity to shove me out like I was just some guest overstaying her welcome. But I wasn't going to fight. I wasn't going to yell. Why? Because in 8 days, the game would flip. And the shed? It was the only thing they'd be walking away with. The week that followed was a masterclass in silent preparation. Every morning I woke before dawn, made my coffee, and sat quietly at the kitchen table, the one Diane had taken over with nursery plans and colour palettes. She never once asked if I wanted my space back. She assumed it was hers now. Lloyd spent his days tinkering with the shed, painting the walls a soft yellow, installing a tiny window, even wheeling in a battered mini-fridge he'd found at a garage sale. "Look, Mom," he said proudly, "you won't even have to come into the house for snacks." How convenient. For them. Dan, meanwhile, took ownership of everything else, parking in my spot, hanging his jacket on my hook, rearranging my furniture like he'd already signed the deed. And through it all, I smiled. I smiled when Diane asked if I liked the mobile she picked for the crib. I smiled when Dan told me I'd be more comfortable eating dinner in the shed, so the baby could have peace and quiet. I even smiled when Lloyd showed me the space heater he'd found, an ancient thing that looked like it would short-circuit on contact, because in 2 days, none of it would matter. They thought they were solving a housing issue. They didn't realize they were writing themselves out of the story. By Friday morning, Diane was on the phone with someone, loud enough for me to hear through the paper-thin walls. "No, she's being totally reasonable," she said. "Honestly, I thought she'd freak out, but she's actually excited. She keeps calling it her cozy little apartment." I never said that, but Diane had already built her narrative. Dan, on the other hand, was planning my financial future. She'll still have water and power, he told Diane. We're maintaining the place. I mean, it's only fair she pays a little rent once things settle. They were planning to charge me rent, to live in my own shed, on my own land, behind my own house. That afternoon I made the final call to Margaret. They'll all be out by Sunday at 6, I said. Perfect, she replied. The crew arrives Sunday evening. They'll handle everything from there. It was done. Saturday came like a dress rehearsal for their own downfall. Diane sat on the couch directing Lloyd and Dan as they moved her nursery furniture into the master bedroom. They even asked where I wanted my last few boxes. Anywhere, I said. I'm sure I'll find the right spot. They mistook my quiet for submission, again. That night, they threw a little celebration. Pizza, paper plates, cheap beer. Dan raised a glass. To new beginnings, he said. Everyone cheered. I stood, smiling, holding my water. Actually, I said, I have something I'd like to say. The room fell still. The perfect little plan was seconds away from combustion, and I was about to light the match. I stood in my living room, for the last time with a glass of water in my hand and 23 eyes on me. Diane smiled like she expected me to give a speech about how honoured I felt. Dan leaned back, smug and self-satisfied. Lloyd slouched in the chair like a king on his throne. I want to thank you all, I began, voice calm, steady. You've taught me so many valuable lessons. They nodded, still thinking this was going exactly how they planned. You've shown me that sacrifice only matters when it's voluntary, that generosity becomes a burden when it's taken for granted, and that love, real love, requires respect. The room started to shift. The smiles faltered. And over the last 8 months, you've shown me exactly who you are. Lloyd sat up straighter. Dan's brow furrowed. Diane blinked, confused. I've cooked, cleaned, paid the bills, and quietly watched you make plans for my life, without so much as asking if I agreed. You moved into my home and acted like it was your right. You took and never once thought to ask if I had anything left to give. Silence, heavy, uncomfortable. And that's why tomorrow morning you'll need to find somewhere else to live. The room exploded. Diane's voice shot up an octave. What do you mean? I'm 7 months pregnant. Where are we supposed to go? You can't do that, Mom, Lloyd barked, on his feet now, red-faced. We live here. No, I said calmly. You've been staying here. There's a difference. Dan narrowed his eyes. You're bluffing. I pulled the folded contract from my purse and laid it gently on the coffee table. 6-month lease, $25,000. Starts midnight last night. As of this moment, you're all trespassing. Diane burst into tears, the loud, performative kind she'd perfected as a child. How could you do this to me, to your grandchild? The same way you did this to me, I replied, without asking, without caring, without hesitation. Lloyd clenched his fists. You can't just throw us out. I looked him dead in the eyes. You're 28, Lloyd. You haven't paid a cent to live here. What exactly do you think you're entitled to? The silence that followed was delicious. Only Beverly looked at me differently. No shock, no anger, just understanding. The way someone looks when they finally get it. Later that night, I packed a single bag, walked out the front door, and didn't look back. I checked into a motel across town, small and quiet. No shouting, no demands. No one asking me to shrink for their comfort. And in the morning, I watched from across the street as the railroad company's crew arrived. Clipboards, cameras, moving trucks. By the time Diane and Dan pulled up with a U-Haul, the house was no longer theirs to take. And me, I was finally free. By Sunday afternoon, they were gone. Diane waddled up the driveway with Dan close behind her, dragging boxes and frustration. They tried to talk their way past the staging crew, but money talks louder than entitlement. The workers didn't argue. They pointed to the contract, the name on the lease, the new rules. They'd spent months planning my exile. Now they were the ones being escorted out. I sat across the street in my car, sipping coffee, watching it all unfold. I felt no guilt, only clarity. They weren't victims. They were just finally facing the reality they'd spent years avoiding. Lloyd showed up an hour later in his beat-up Honda, his trunk barely closed, overflowing with his clutter. He stormed out, yelling at the crew, waving his arms like someone still used to getting his way. But this time, there was no one left to clean up after him. The house was no longer their kingdom, no longer my burden. It was a rental now, furnished for tourists with money to burn and train rides to catch. That evening, I checked into an extended stay hotel just outside town. Small, quiet, peaceful. A kitchenette, a soft bed, space that was mine. I ordered Chinese takeout and stared out the window as the sun dipped behind the trees. For the first time in decades, I wasn't waiting on anyone. I wasn't needed. I wasn't trapped. The next morning, I started planning. Real planning, not survival. Living. Scotland would be first, then Ireland, then maybe Eastern Europe. Anywhere a train could take me, and no one expected me to fold their laundry when I arrived. I started writing again too. Not journal entries, a book, a memoir. I called it The Shed, How I Learned to Stop Being Convenient. The writing poured out like I'd been holding my breath for years, because I had. By spring, I had enough for a manuscript. My publisher sent a modest but real advance. It was the first money I'd earned in years that wasn't attached to someone else's needs. I decided not to renew the lease with the railroad company. 6 months was enough. I sold the house to a young couple just starting their life together, excited, wide-eyed, ready to build something new. They called it their dream home. Good. Let it be. With the sale proceeds and the lease money, I bought a quiet cottage in Vermont, close to a train station, far from the past. I only kept Beverly's address. She sent Christmas cards and white roses on my birthday with a note that said, "I'm proud of you, Mom." And finally, that was enough. No more dinners for people who didn't thank me. No more beds given up for convenience. No more pretending I was okay with being invisible, because I wasn't just out of the shed. I was out of the story they'd written for me, and I was writing my own now. If this story hit a nerve or made you cheer for Martha's revenge, drop a comment below. Have you ever been taken for granted by family? We want to hear your story. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed the twist, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story of power, payback, and personal freedom. New uploads every week that prove one thing. The quiet ones aren't always weak. Sometimes they're just waiting to strike. Turn on notifications so you're the first to know when the next chapter drops. Thanks for watching and stay strong.